Thank you, Zeke. Next, I'd like to invite Sam Flanagan, a fisheries biologist for the National Marine Fisheries Service in Arcata, California, to provide an update and overview of the salmon recovery efforts.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. It's going to talk a little bit today about these critters, Coho salmon, and our recovery efforts, and try and do it all in 15 minutes or less. Briefly, recovery planning. We're looking at what do recovered fish populations look like? What do we need to do to get there? How much is it going to cost? And what sort of monitoring do we need to do to ensure that we're getting there? In terms of West Coast salmonid stocks that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, we fall into the Southern Oregon, Northern California recovery domain. The series of recovery domains up and down the West Coast that include one or more listed species. Here in our SONCC domain, we have a couple of issues unique to this domain is we have a lot of overlap with species that we share to the south with some of our other regional offices. And we have a transboundary issue with the state of Oregon, and I'll talk a little bit about the efforts we're working on with the state of Oregon. The recovery process is basically happening in two stages. The first stage is a technical stage, basically led by our technical recovery teams, which are teams composed of our regional science center folks, folks out there on the ground who have a fair amount of local knowledge about Coho salmon across their range. The second stage is the actual development of the recovery plans, taking the technical information, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and actually coming up with the roadmap for recovery. What do we need to do to get these fish delisted? Again, this first phase is largely a technical exercise, generating a series of technical documents, basically describing the historic structure of these populations, what do we need to have viable, self-sustaining populations? What sort of spatial distribution characteristics, abundance, productivity, and then what sort of monitoring do we need to do to ensure that these populations are heading in the right direction over the long term? And then kind of the last part of my talk, I'll talk about where we're at now with the actual recovery planning process. So this phase one effort, like I said, there's a series of technical reports looking at what is the historic population, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. What are the characteristics of viable populations? What do we need to have self-sustaining populations? What do they look like? And then putting it all together and asking the question, what do we need to have a viable ESU as a whole? And what sort of monitoring do we need to do to ensure that that's happening? So this idea of historic population structure is really looking at asking the question of, for a given historic Coho population, can it survive in isolation over a 100-year time frame? So there's three divisions that have come out of one of the TRT products, looking at the historic population structure. The idea that there's a functionally independent population, and these are populations that can survive in isolation over a 100-year time frame. They don't really require immigration of outside individuals from nearby populations to keep going for the long haul. That's in contrast to dependent populations, which really depend upon immigration of individuals from larger and adjacent populations to keep them going. And in isolation, they have a low likelihood of surviving over the long haul. So putting it all together, one of the TRT products that's come out has taken the SONCC Coho salmon ESU and divided it out into 45 historic populations that have these three categories of function: functionally independent, potentially independent, and dependent populations. And this is really going to be the framework for our recovery plans, looking at this on a population by population basis. And I'll go through what that means here in a couple of slides, but this is really, these are the populations we're going to be looking at in detail, kind of more on a more regional and meta population scale. If you think back to the map there, there's various diversity strata. There are interior populations, there are coastal coho populations, and those are kind of further subdivided into the large river basins, the Rogue, the Klamath, the Eel, and then the various smaller coastal subbasins. And these are kind of form the basis for looking at what we need to do to create viable individual populations. Then how do we fit all these together by river basin, by region, and ensure that there's the necessary spatial diversity so we get to a viable ESU.